Hey, this is Jay Watts from Merely Human Ministries, and welcome to the Human Things podcast. I think this is episode 2 of season 3. Season 3, episode 2. Boom.
3, 2, 1.
Here we go!
All right. Welcome back to the Human Things podcast. This is Jay Watts from Merely Human Ministries. Let's get... First of all, if you have listened in the past, there are people that have listened all the way through. They tell me that they've listened from the beginning, and they encourage me, by the way, telling me, man, it's getting good, which makes me wonder how bad it was at the beginning. I must maybe as me, because I've had great guests on, so they're saying you're getting better. That's good. That's good to hear. In the early episodes, I talked a lot about Hall & Oates, probably more than most people would think is necessary for me to talk about Hall & Oates, but it was part of a thing where I was saying, look, if we judge musicians and bands by their ability to put together a good 3-song set, like a solid 3-song set, I was arguing that Hall & Oates can put together almost as solid a 3-song set as almost anybody else out there. That is, as odd as it is to think, Hall & Oates rocks. Now, here's the thing. The only reason I'm bringing up Hall & Oates again, I don't know if you're aware of this, JD, but Daryl Hall recently filed a restraining order against John Oates. And that, for some reason, was heartbreaking to me because they're forever linked, right? And you see this, there was a period where there was some resentment between Simon and Garfunkel, mostly from Garfunkel's side towards Simon, Daryl Hall and John Oates. Who knows what happened? I don't even know who the other guy in Wham was. I mean, I have no idea. It was George Michael and that other guy in Wham. I have no idea who he was. So obviously there's always a place where there's talent, and then there's less talent. The White Stripes, I think, comes up with that too, right? I mean, you see that with them as well. So Daryl Hall has filed a restraining order against John Oates. There is no more comment. That's it. I just wanted to mention it's fairly, given how much time, way too much time I devoted on this show to the greatness of 3 or 4 songs of Hall & Oates. That Daryl Hall and John Oates are now at odds with each other to the point there's been a restraining order filed it's a statement on the state of the world right now. It's a microcosm. It's a picture, a moment, if you will, that encapsulates how messed up the world has become. The world is divided. Daryl Hall and John Oates, and if they can go down, any of us can go. So hug your family tonight. Take care of them. Don't let yourself become Hall & Oates. All right, and number 2, I would like to say that I have no update on the escalation of tensions between otters and people. That I've kept my ears out there, my eyes looking. We did on several episodes talk about the growing escalation between Animal Kingdom and America. I will say this. I recently found out that I'm not the only person that has very strong feelings about chimpanzees. There was Joe Rogan had mentioned how awful chimpanzees were on some show and how abusive and angry that they are, and I saw a clip of that come up where he was saying about a guy who had raised a chimpanzee and then had to give it up because of their natural tendency that if you have something and don't give it to them, or give something to one chimpanzee and don't give it to another, that they just lose their minds and get ultra violent, and because they're crazy, powerful, and strong, that's a problem. And that's it. If you see chimpanzees being dressed up, it's always immature chimpanzees. You cannot put clothes on an adult chimpanzee. He will kill you. And so then they shared this horrifying story that I want to go into right now on the Joe Rogan. And I don't even watch or listen to Joe Rogan, but the reels come up every once in a while, so I'll watch a couple of minutes of them. The only reason I bring that up is because I've often taken heat in my own family for my strong feelings about being anti-chimpanzee. Now, when I say anti-chimpanzee, it doesn't mean that I want to go start a war with the chimpanzees, right? I'm not angry about the existence of chimpanzees. I just, orangutans and gorillas, they're awesome. Chimpanzees, and even bonobos, who are like this crazy sexually charged group of chimpanzees, but they tend to be less violent. I mean, it's like there were chimpanzees and bonobos. If you divide them up, it's the ultra violent chimpanzee and the ultra sexually charged life of the bonobos. My son, in his anthropology class at university, gave me his anthropology book just so that I could read the chapter on bonobos, because he said I will never be the same. It is just so disgusting the way that they are as far as the sexually libertine practices of the bonobos. But so if you look at like the worst traits of human beings, you got the bonobos existing in that sexual realm, and then you got chimpanzees in the violent realm. So I brought that up only because I was fascinated to find out that I was not looking at comments underneath. I was not the only person that has these strong feelings about chimpanzees. Apparently a lot of people do. And I told somebody, if you've ever, I used to love them. I used to be fascinated by them. I used to watch, Jane Goodall was the chimpanzee. Was Diane Fossey was the gorillas, and Jane Goodall was the chimpanzee. So I thought, man, look at, and they talk about peaceful they are, and they're relatives of ours, and they are. I mean, they're closer related to us genetically than they are any other animal. Right? I mean, chimpanzees genetically are closer to human beings than they are to any other animal. So when you talk about the classes of chimpanzees, like human beings, Jared Diamond wrote a book called The Third Chimpanzee. And he's talking about us, right? You got chimpanzees, you got bonobos, and you got humans. And the whole point of the book, it's a fascinating book, by the way. I enjoy reading Jared Diamond. I don't agree with him about everything, but I really enjoy reading Jared Diamond. He's most famous for Guns, Germs, and Steel and Collapse. Collapse is a book that has been, even my students in universities will tell me that their teachers, anthropology teachers or government teachers will say this is garbage. But in The Third Chimpanzee, he wrote this entire book for the purpose of trying to demonstrate that there had to be some explanation for the difference between a chimpanzee and a human being, because they're radically different things. And we're so genetically close to each other. And that's where he points out, like, they are closer to us than they are to any other human being, by far. I mean, to any other animal. Man, I am all over the place right now. Chimpanzees are closer to us genetically than any other animal. They have a better relationship genetically to us than they have to anything. He said it's so small. The difference between chimpanzees and human beings is so small on a genetic level, on a biological level. It's difficult to explain the massive differences in the kind of animals that we are. I've talked about this before. I think when I'll be speaking someplace and objectors to the types of arguments that I make will stand up and they'll say, well, we see tool making in chimpanzees. We see tool making in all sorts of animals. We do. You're absolutely right. We do see basic tool making. We understand that for example, chimpanzees can take a reed or a stick, strip it down, and then jam it into a termite mound and pull it out to use it as a means of trap. That's pretty advanced tool because they fashion the tool. It's not like they just grab a rock and start hitting things with a rock. They take things, they fashion it into an instrument, and then they use it to make their life easier. An energy saving device, whatever you want to look at it. And that is tool making. That really is. And you see, by the way, tool making, another thing. We've seen in crows or corvids are capable of making tools as well. Taking something, adjusting it and fashioning it to meet their needs and to accomplishing a goal with it. That's true. But, as I told those people, I drove to this place today, guided by a phone, communicating with satellites that could follow my every move on this planet. Those are not the same level of tool making we're talking about here. So as impressed as I am with the kind of tools that animals can make, and I'm an animal lover outside of chimpanzees. Most of the animal kingdom I like a lot. But the difference Jared Diamond's saying is immense. This is not a small difference. It's a huge difference, right? So, and I used to love them and be fascinated by that. And then when I was younger, I was watching this David Attenborough, one of those BBC David Attenborough shows. I can't remember which one it was, but they came out every few years. They would do this crazy thing. Technology would advance with cameras, their ability to see, follow, and track animals. And he's out in the forest with these, and he's saying they're attacking, right? They're getting ready to hunt down this monkey. So you have this monkey, and the chimpanzees divert it. And then you have a group pushing it towards another group of chimpanzees that are waiting for them. So it's impressive as far as strategically the way that they do it. You see this kind of strategic advancement and also orcas as well, where you see high level animals being able to use tactical attacks on other beings. And so they do this, drive that monkey into the other chimpanzees waiting for them. And then, and word of warning, this is kind of gross, so if you want to plug your ears for a second, then they tear it to pieces while it's alive and eating this monkey while it's screaming the entire time. And so this was just the beginning, by the way. They also show great chimpanzees going to war with each other and how they beat each other. And so that moment changed how I looked at chimpanzees forever. Altered my view of chimpanzees forever. And then everything I learned after the fact only supported that view, right? Everything, you sometimes you find something out about something and then you learn more and you think, okay, maybe that was an extreme reaction. Everything I learned about them after that only made that position stronger. Even when I think it was called Chimpanzee that Disney did for Earth Day. There was a period there where Disney was releasing movies on Earth Day. They may still be doing it. I don't know. I'm not the biggest Disney fan like I used to be. They released these movies. They released one called Chimpanzee. My kids came home from the movie and they said, Dad, I know you don't like chimpanzees, but you would love this movie. I said, why? What happened? And they said, this chimpanzee was orphaned. And this group, including this male, took him in and took care of him. And that never happens. I mean, or it's so rare. So it's just this, it was beautiful, Dad. They took him in, they raised him, they made him a part of his family. They took responsibility for him. I said, Dad, I know you don't like chimpanzees, but you would have loved this movie. You would have, I said, that does sound beautiful, children. So it doesn't sound like, I'm so glad you liked it. I said, can I ask you a quick question though? And they said, yeah, go ahead. And I said, how did the chimpanzee, the little young chimpanzee, how did he get orphaned? And they said, well, a group of other chimpanzees killed his family. I was like, yeah, exactly. Exactly. You bring that pro-chimpanzee garbage into my house. Don't come in here trying to sell me this idea that they're not what I think they are. Exactly. That's exactly how I became orphaned, and I knew it before you even had to tell it to me. And you were trying to hide that, right? You were trying to bury the lead. You didn't want it's propaganda, my friends. It was pro-chimpanzee propaganda, and I would have none of it. I'm not even sure how I got on that rant, JD. I'm not even sure where we were going with that one. All right, let's move on from there. Okay, so today, this is not an embryo show. Let me be very clear about that. I'm not doing an embryo show. Today I want to focus on the Supreme Court of Alabama's decision that I first became aware of when I started getting headlines passed to me that said things like this: Alabama court rules frozen embryos are children, chilling IVF advocates. And then for days and days, I see people online saying things about this attack on in vitro fertilization, this insane religious, and began with this intense focus on the religious aspects of this argument, and that this decision was based on religious views, and it was forcing their religion and their view of human life on the people of Alabama, and just fear of what this meant now for in vitro fertilization in the state of Alabama and where we were going. So I decided I want to do a very focused conversation about just a few points. I don't want to overwhelm us with points on this. I want to go just over a few points of this. Number one, and JD mentioned this when I first saw him today, he said, I saw your Facebook post where you said, before you get all emotional about a decision, a court decision, you should read the court decision. And we went through this with Dobbs versus Jackson, where almost everything everyone said about the Dobbs versus Jackson decision in the media was wrong. And every single thing that they tried to fearmonger and stir people up in fears of what was going to happen as a result of it was actually addressed in the decision in writing by the judges. And surprise, surprise, the same thing is true again. All of the things I hear people yelling about and screaming about and freaking out about, and all the things that they're saying, and some of them are just factually inaccurate, and some of them, and we'll have an embryo episode. I don't want to do an embryo episode today because there's an author that I want to have come on and do the embryo episode with us, who's an actual expert in this field, and so I'd like to have him here just so that we don't have to worry about credentialists. I don't want to have to worry about people bugging me about credentials at this point. So what we're going to do is something easy. Today, I want to just read. Now, I'm not going to read this, but I want to, from the Supreme Court decision itself, the Alabama Supreme Court decision, which was a 6-1 decision with some concurring opinions written, that they said, look, I agree with the decision, but I want to say things where I might disagree with some of the wording of the majority opinion. But it was 6-1 in favor of it. And I want to address certain things that came out of that decision from the decision itself so that we can get a sense of what actually happened. Because the hysteria that happens, and this hysteria has multiple levels. First of all, people who don't like the decision, news outlets who have an editorial point of view, they initially report it. And then people who agree with the editorial point of the view of that news outlet, but have a little bit less nuance, report it in a different manner on their social media stuff. And by the time it gets to Twitter and Threads, by the way, congratulations, Mark Zuckerberg. You managed to make something as vile and stupid as Twitter overnight. I get inundated with all of these threads thinking that I would be interested in them on my Instagram account, which I like my Instagram account because I do things on Instagram. Like I have an Instagram account dedicated to my daughter's lacrosse and to all lacrosse. And I don't do that on my personal one or my professional one because I know that people who are not interested in my love of lacrosse. But I have one for lacrosse. And I like that. I enjoy Instagram. What I don't enjoy is constantly seeing recommendations for threads. And it takes me 2 seconds to look at the posts that are going on threads to realize threads is already every bit as stupid as Twitter was. I never liked Twitter, by the way. And I don't like X all that much more. It's just not my thing. It's weaponized concision is what it is. It's how can I be as hurtful and hateful, as stupid as I can be in the shortest number of characters or in the least number of characters possible. And it feeds the worst elements of human communication. I was thinking the other day about social media, particularly about X and Threads and the kind of things that I see on there and formerly on Twitter and then some on Facebook. And you know what I was thinking about, JD? I was thinking about these guys that I knew in college. And I remember this one guy who came over to my house, the house that I shared. Me and 2 other guys lived together. We had a back deck. Everybody would sit on the deck and be students and whatever that means. And this guy would come over and he would sit and hold court with the other people that liked him. And he fashioned himself an artist and he would talk about the fascist tendencies of the president of the university. And everyone was a fascist in his eyes. And those people would sit around him and, oh yeah, we're all fascists. And just, they were so engrossed with him. And I thought, man, how happy that guy must have been with the advent of social media. I mean, that must have been his day, man. Because back in those days, it was so easy when you heard the fascist guy talking or this other guy talking about capitalism and Marxism and whoever was just running their mouth about anything. The easiest thing in the world was to just say, oh, they're a crank, they're a flake, they're a weirdo and move on with your life. They may have 3 or 4 people that take them seriously and they go down to, we didn't really have Cafe Intermezzo, right? They're going to go hang out at Cafe Intermezzo and drink coffee and talk about fascism and capitalism and Marxism and nobody takes them particularly seriously. But now they live in a world where they have a voice, and that voice is Twitter and Threads. And even the funniest thing about Threads is they block everybody. I mean, that's another thing. They're all so proud. I block everybody who doesn't agree with me. That's psychologically healthy. So by the time it gets there, you have the news outlet reports it, then you have the next set of people report it, and then it gets to Threads and it gets to Twitter, and it's so stupid. Then you have this large audience of people who have no idea what was actually said because the information is being filtered to them through people who hate the information. That's a big deal. You should not trust a news source that hates the news that they're reporting to you. You should find other views. I do it, by the way. I spend more time reading people who disagree with me. Far more time reading people who disagree with me than reading sources who agree with me. The second I see something come out that I think sounds weird, I immediately start looking for sources to balance it out. And even if I ultimately find out that it was every bit as weird or as horrible as it sounded initially, and there have been cases like that where there was never a moment where it got better. I'm completely blanking on the name of that young black man. I think it was in Chicago, that child that was out holding a BB gun in the park and the police pulled up and shot him. And when you first heard that headline, that can't be true, can it? And so you keep looking into it, this is every bit as bad as it sounded immediately. There is no relent from how awful this is, how devastatingly tragic what happened to that young man was. And so there are stories like that where you think, how could that have ever happened? How could somebody, in his, I think it was a toy gun. I'm confusing his, was a toy gun to a gentleman who was buying a BB gun for his son, a black man that was buying a BB gun for his son in Walmart, and it was unboxed when he pulled it off the shelf and he was carrying it around, and somebody called the police, and the police came in and shot him while he was shopping. And you hear stories like that, you're like, okay, boy, that can't be that actually happened. And you look into it, it exactly happened that way, and that is horrifying. So there are stories where that happens, but I'm always skeptical at first. I want to make sure when I hear awful things that the truly awful thing did happen. And so I check people who come against it a little bit as best as I can to see if there's any balance to it. Sometimes there is no balance. In this particular case, the danger is the people who first started reporting this hated what the Supreme Court of Alabama said. And then it just got filtered through people who hated it more and had more emotional responses to it. So by the time it starts being popularly spread on sites like Threads or Twitter or Instagram or Facebook or wherever, it's gone through so many filters of people who are angry about it that it doesn't even make sense, and you're not getting a true reporting of it. So what I wanted to do was look at what the Supreme Court case actually said. And it's pretty interesting in the sense of, and some background for what the court case was. All right. So what was the scenario that brought us to this place? The plaintiffs in these consolidated appeals, this is from it, are the parents of several embryonic children, each of whom was created through in vitro fertilization, and until the incident giving rise to these cases had been kept alive in cryogenic nursery while they awaited implantation. So you had two different families. And in the United States, and I say in the United States because this isn't true in every country, and it's going to come up more later, but in the United States, we recognize that the most expensive part of in vitro fertilization is the embryo production stage. That costs a lot of money. But it costs a lot of money whether you make one embryo or whether you make 6 embryos or 10 embryos. It's the process of embryo creation that's expensive. And so to be more cost effective in vitro fertilization, and again, this is not an IVF episode. I may do one of those later, but that's not what this is about. But we're going over the factual nature of the case here. They encourage people to say, look, if the cost is prohibitive to you to make few embryos, make more, and then we can preserve those embryos, freeze them in a process. And then as you are interested in having children, we can do the implantation process, which is much less expensive than the embryo production process. So in order for you to keep the cost of IVF down, you should produce more embryos early. Now, there's other aspects that come into this that I don't want to get into today, but we'll just mention them when you have stuff like embryonic screening for genetic abnormalities, so that you can destroy embryos that might not be what you want them to be. But here is a point that is not at dispute in this case. It is stated in the Supreme Court case that this is not in dispute. That from the moment that human life begins, at conception, is the terminology that everybody here accepts, it is fully a human being. This isn't the case of like pro-choice versus pro-life. This isn't people who think that embryonic human beings aren't human beings. Everybody here agrees that an embryo is a fully human. They agree with that. The difference of opinion starts to come, we'll see. Okay, so they have these cryogenically frozen. And then between 2013 and 2016, each set of parents went to a fertility clinic operated by the Center for Reproductive Medicine to undergo IVF treatments. During those treatments, doctors were able to help the plaintiffs conceive children by joining the mother's eggs and the sperms in vitro. So in vitro just means in glass, I believe, is actually what the terminology means. In vivo, it means in life, and in vitro means in glass. It's conceiving human life outside of the body. So the actual reproductive means are very similar in the sense that, as all human beings, it is the fusion of an egg and a sperm to create a new, unique human life. It's just not being done by sexual reproduction in vivo. In the woman, in life, it's being done in vitro in glass, whether it's in glass or not. So they made these, and then the parties agree that if properly safeguarded, an embryo can remain alive in a cryogenic nursery indefinitely, several decades, perhaps longer. So they led to the creation of several embryos. They They implanted some. They contracted for the center's cryogenic nursery, which was located within the same building as the local hospital, the Mobile Infirmary Medical Center. The hospital is owned and operated by the Mobile Infirmary Association. The plaintiffs allege that the center was obligated to keep the cryogenic nursery secured and monitored at all times, but in December 2020, a patient at the hospital managed to wander into the center's fertility clinic through an unsecured doorway. The patient then entered the cryogenic nursery and removed several embryos. The sub-zero temperatures at which the embryo have been stored freeze-burned the patient's hand, causing the patient to drop the embryos on the floor, killing them. So that's how this case is generated. They had implanted some. They were preserving the opportunity to be able to implant others. The hospital didn't safeguard properly. And so this is a wrongful death civil case. That's what's happened here. A wrongful death civil case, not a criminal case, a civil case against the people whose responsibility it was to protect those embryos. So in defense, the defense has claimed that since they were not implanted yet, they were not children. Now, here's the big deal, right? Okay, so in a wrongful death, in Alabama's Wrongful Death of a Minor Act says that if you cause the death, and it includes unborn in it, it includes the unborn in it, in the Alabama's. So the question then is not whether or not the unborn are children or are human or have value or are the subject of this area of law. In all of those cases is true and accepted by every party. The question then became whether or not an embryo in vitro and still being preserved, cryopreserved, counted as children under the law of the Alabama's Wrongful Death Act. Okay, so the case decision, which they claim Alabama declared embryos in IVF are children. That's not what happened. What they did was they got a very narrow set of questions they had to answer. Is under the Wrongful Death Act, do these qualify as children already protected under the law? And under the definition of children in which they're operating in a law that already exists, in accordance to the Alabama Constitution, the unborn already count as children. Embryos already count legally as children. This is the existing environment that this case arises within. And the Alabama Supreme Court said, in settling this, we can't see why the fact that this human life exists outside of the mother is relevant to whether or not it belongs within the category of human children that are already protected under Alabama law. So they said this is a pretty easy case for us. We don't see the grounds to be able to dismiss them as human based on where they are. If you remember if you've ever heard us talk about the philosopher Stephen Schwartz SLED acronym, size, level of development, environment, or degree of dependency are not adequate philosophical standards by which to disqualify the unborn from valuable human life. Size, level of development, environment, or degree of dependency. In this particular case, what the Supreme Court of Alabama said was environment does not disqualify them from the human family. What they are substantially is an embryonic human life that will develop as any other embryonic human life will once restored back to its natural environment. But the fact that we created it outside of the mother doesn't disqualify it from being a valuable member of the human family under Alabama law that already recognizes the unborn, and they don't see environment as necessary or sufficient to disqualify it from the human family under the civil case and the laws that already exist. They did not declare embryos were children. That was already the Alabama law. The question was, do embryos outside of the mother count as children? And the Supreme Court said it does. That's the case. They also understand that this raises troubling questions for where they're going forward as far as IVF and things of like that. And they say that just isn't the place for us right now. And the language resolves the only issue on appeal with respect to the plaintiff's wrongful death claims and renders moot their common law negligence and wantonness claims. He says, look, we understand that there are other things that are going to be affected by this, but that's for the legislation. The legislators need to pass legislation. They need to deal with creating law around this particular area. What we can't do is legislate from the bench. We have to decide what the law says based on the standards that already exist, and then give our decision based on that. So 6 of 7 judges said, this just is the law. If you don't like it, change the law. But it just is the law. And that's an easy decision for us to make. Now, there's 2 things I want to talk about, or 3 things I want to talk about in addition. So that's the facts of the case. It laid out, I mean, we could go on. It's a long decision. I've read it and I've got it here in front of me, and we could go into it in more in depth. But that is the thing that was decided that day. And I wanted to break that down, hopefully in the simplest way possible. Do you think that made clear? All right. Okay. So we're good. So the idea of what was done that day, much like when somebody says to me, Dobbs versus Jackson stripped rights away from women. I say, well, no, it didn't. What Dobbs versus Jackson did is recognize that in Roe v. Wade, there was a claim to a right that existed that never existed in the Constitution of the United States. All it did was invalidate rights claims that existed on illegitimate legal grounds. It said you never had a right to do it, not a constitutional right to do this. Now, it says the states may decide what they wish to do, but as according to the United States Constitution and according to the United States Supreme Court, this just isn't our thing. We shouldn't be involved in this, and we certainly shouldn't be telling people there's a constitutional right to an abortion when there is none, and that the claim to a constitutional right to abortion doesn't meet any of the standards necessary to be able to be claimed as an unenumerated right. It doesn't reflect the founding fathers. It doesn't reflect the initial people, their view of unborn life. It hasn't been a tradition throughout all American history that people saw as foundational or fundamental to their rights as the ability to get abortions. It's just not there, right? There is no there on that. There is no right through the Constitution of the United States. They didn't take rights away. They just demonstrated that the right that was claimed on illegitimate legal grounds, and said, go back to the states and sort this out through the election process, but don't expect us to keep this up, to keep telling the rest of the country that they're not allowed to have discussions about this. So in the same way, this is a very limited decision. The Supreme Court of Alabama said, we have existing law. We have existing precedent. We have very specific language. The embryo already counts as a child. And we're going to get into that in just a second, what they mean by a child. And so the question is, does it count as a child just only when it's inside the mother, or does it also count as a child when it's being cryopreserved? And if it is cryopreserved child, then the wrongful death is, that we can determine in this particular case that they have reason or grievance to be upset about what happened, because their children, whether they were in the mother or whether they're in a protected place, were destroyed by the incompetence of others. And so that's all that was decided that day. That was all that this decision addressed. And they say very clearly, this is a limited focus of our decision. It has nothing to do with legislation, has nothing to do with IVF rights in the sense of what we're allowing other people to do. We're just saying that given the scope of this case and the law that exists in Alabama, we are recognizing that in vitro embryos are just like in vivo embryos, and they are human beings, and they are children under the law, and they are protected in the same way that any other children under the Wrongful Death Act are protected. That was it. That's the limit of it. So other things I want to talk about. Let's go. We've used that word children a lot. So let's go to that for a second. Because I find myself to be a careful guy. As much as I can be in language, I try to be careful. And I will say this, I'm not a huge fan of referring to embryos and fetuses as babies all the time. Not because I think there's something inaccurate about it. And by the way, I don't scold pro-lifers who do. I don't do that. I don't go out and tell other pro-lifers they're wrong about something and try to get in arguments about how they're talking. I think it takes all kinds to fight for life. And if you're fighting from life from a position that you think that the unborn are babies, and that motivates you and impassions you to go out and fight for the value of human life, more power to you. Just because you use that language doesn't mean I'm going to, and I use the language that I use doesn't mean that you have to. I just am happy that so many people are out there fighting for life and that you feel motivated enough to do it. I don't use the baby language, but because I don't want to have to argue over the term baby. And if I can avoid having to argue over the term baby, I don't want to multiply the battlegrounds, right? I talk about the game Risk a lot when I'm discussing these things. You can take over a country in Risk. If you've ever played the board game Risk, you can take over another country. But the second you take over that country, what do you have to do? You have to defend that country now. And so your resources are spread out. And every time you take over another country, you spread out your resources and have to defend something else. So using this as far as the rhetorical device of using the term baby, what I mean by this is if I'm arguing for the value of human life and I can do that without using the term baby, and I know if I introduce the term baby, I'm going to have to argue about the term baby, then why argue about that at all? I just have no interest in that conversation. So you'll never really hear me talking about babies when I'm talking about the pro-life position. It's just not what I do. Saving human life, intrinsic dignity. I'll use the term fetus and embryo because they don't bother me. I mean, I've talked about this before on this show, and I've written about it quite a bit. Embryo is a state. It's a growth stage. It's a stage of development that a life passes through. It's not a thing. There are not embryos. There's embryonic humans, right? It's not a thing that exists in and of itself. It is a stage of development that other things pass through. And a fetal stage is the same thing. A fetus isn't a thing. There's a fetal human being. So that kind of language doesn't bother me. So I would not probably, when I first heard, the whole reason I don't is exactly what you saw over the past week or two since this decision became public. The hysterical fighting over the term children. Now, here's where we go back to the idea where I said, read the decision, man. Read the decision. Instead of getting crazy about it, anytime you get into a discussion with somebody and you're arguing about important things, one of the first things that you need to do, one of the most fundamentally important things that you can do is to clarify definitions, right? In any given, I was in a debate one time at a college campus and we were talking about a term, and I defined the term. They thought they had a case as far as in the debate that was a knockdown argument. And I found out what they were doing. And so this is going to be the easiest thing in the world. So when the debate started, I gave a very clear definition for the way that I was using the term in my argument, and it invalidated their whole argument. I said, so if you want to argue whether or not that's a legitimate definition, let's go ahead and do that. That's what we should be arguing. But you don't freak out about a term when we haven't defined it yet. So Alabama has determined under their law that embryos are children, and people are freaking out because they're thinking of children like children are my children running around my house. They're the ones that are tearing things up or yelling or screaming, whatever they're doing, wild things that children are doing, playing on playgrounds, screaming, crying, laughing, demanding things, loving, hugging, all of these things that we associate with young children, the sort of uncontrolled chaos of childhood. And that's what they think of when they think of children. And so when you say an embryo is a child, like, no. That's a child right there. That's not, an embryo is not one of those things. Well, that's your definition of child. But you have to understand what they're saying under the law when they say an embryo is a child. You can't get mad at them for using a term just because you define the term differently and say it can't possibly be true that an embryo is a child, because a child is like that crazy thing running around my house and an embryo is nothing like that. Well, why don't you ask them, going back to Greg Kokel's tactical approach to conversations and his first most important question that you can ask, when you say the word child, what do you mean? Before you have an emotional reaction, before you tweet or X or thread or whatever we call the things nowadays, before you go out in the world and have a hissy fit online to please all of your followers that agree exactly with your point, why don't you ask the question, what does the Alabama court mean when they say an embryo is a child? You know why it's important to ask that question? Because they answer it very, very, very early in the decision. As a matter of fact, I'm looking right now at page 9 of the decision, and they offer, at least I can tell, something like 6 different sources to support their definition of child. And it's a very simple definition. When they talk about a child, they say, term in vitro would not qualify as a child or person, both being never been delivered biological, not in utero, as they're starting to deal with this definition issue. So they say, okay, how do we define it? All right. They give 3 different definitions. One first, Merriam-Webster's. The court's most cited defines child as an unborn or recently born person. Unborn person, recently born person. All the mainstream dictionaries are in accord. This is page 13. The Oxford English Dictionary defining child as an unborn or nearly born human being, fetus, or infant. Defining child as an unborn or recently born human being in Webster's Third New International Dictionary. There's no patent or latent ambiguity in the word child. It is not a term of art and contains no inherent uncertainty. This is quoted from another decision. They're saying we have definitions of children, and those definitions include the unborn. And the Wrongful Death of a Minor Act first became a law back in 1871, 1870. So it was an 1872 act in the state of Alabama. They said, okay, look at the leading dictionary of the time, defined the word child as the immediate progeny of parents, and indicated this term encompassed children in the womb. Noah Webster in 1864, to be with child means to be pregnant. Blackstone's Commentaries, the leading authority of the common law, expressly grouped the rights of unborn children with the rights of persons, consistently described the unborn as children, as infants or children, and spoke of such children as sharing in the same right to life that is inherent by nature in every individual. They're not just dropping the word child and expecting you to understand what they mean by that. They're giving very clear definitions and saying that the way that they're using the term child is not ambiguous and is supported by definitions both today in contemporary times and at the time that the Wrongful Death of a Minor Act was passed in 1872 in Alabama. When they say child, they already include, under the law, the unambiguous idea that the unborn are included in that term. So part of the problem there is that you have an idea of what the word child means, and you get mad because you say, not you, I mean, I don't know, a person gets mad, like JD. So you get mad because you say, I know what I mean by children, and if you say the unborn are children, or you say embryos are children, then that makes me mad because I know there's a difference between the two. Well, what an immature response. The first thing that you should do is find out what they mean when they say child. And by the definitions that they've offered, the claim that the embryos are children is fine. It meets the definition of children. I particularly like, by the way, the one that says the immediate progeny of parents. The immediate progeny of parents. It's a basic definition. Does your zygote meet the definition of being your child? Under the terms that we've been offered here, yes, it does. It's a single-celled organism. It just came into existence, but it is a unique human life, biologically human at the beginning, at the very beginning, at the first stages of its development process, but it is still your child. Because even as a single-celled organism, it is the immediate progeny of the parents. It is their child. It may not be a child in some other understanding of that word, but it is a child based on that definition right there. I actually have used the term offspring a lot when I talk because I find that people don't bother me when I use the term offspring. If I said baby or I said child, I get bothered. People want to talk about the definitions, and I just don't have any interest in doing this. But what I say rhetorically and what I believe are two different things. I may not be comfortable with the term baby because there's a whole lot of stuff loaded in there. I am 100% comfortable with the word child. I may not use it all the time, but I have no discomfort in it, and I agree with the wording of this decision. There is no ambiguity there. The immediate progeny of parents. That's what a child is. Whether you want it or not, whether you recognize it or not, biologically, the life living inside of the mother is her child. And what she chooses to do with it is the question of the right or wrong of abortion. But that's not on the table today. Now we're just talking about whether or not they're children. And by the definition offered by the state of Alabama, through their laws, they are children. Is that embryo in vitro the immediate progeny of its parents? Yes, it is. So this was a very simple decision for the Supreme Court of Alabama to make. Let's get past. That's the definition of children. So let's be clear. Alabama Supreme Court does not believe that there is no difference between an embryo and a 3-year-old playing in a park. What they're saying is the differences between them are unimportant in their evaluation as children. That there are fundamentally different things about them in the senses of their capacities and the things that they can do and the ways that we interact with them. But when it comes to the question of whether or not that embryo stored in cryopreservation is the immediate progeny of its parents and biologically human, the answer is emphatically yes. Now, let's go back to what I said earlier about them recognizing that this has implications for in vitro fertilization. They do recognize it. And I will say in one of the other, and at one part of the I think it's in one of the concurring written positions, they don't care. Now, what I mean about that is that, or at least this person that wrote that is not worried about that. And here's why. The case that that person is making is, look, recognizing that someone else is a member of the human family brings with it consequences. It means that we have to adjust how we treat them. So, does recognizing that during the in vitro fertilization process, the embryo production process is the creation of unique human life, human organisms, the immediate progeny of their parents, children. We're making children. And if they're fully human, does that mean that we need to rethink our policy of creating 10 children and putting them in cryopreservation? I think so. I think so. It doesn't mean that IVF is illicit. It doesn't mean, now that in and of itself doesn't mean that, right? I'm not making any judgments about IVF today. I want to stay away from making a judgment one way or another. What I'm saying is that the practice of IVF doesn't become illicit based on that in and of itself. And then the judge writing the opinion points out that in Western European countries, there already are stringent rules about how you can proceed through IVF. You can produce one and plant one. Maybe produce 2 and plant 2. But there's limits about what you can do. Even mentioning in quotation marks that people who follow IVF in the United States call it the Wild West of reproductive technology. The United States is, and of course the IVF industry in the United States does not want regulation because they are largely unregulated. And so the Supreme Court decision says, look, you are far too unregulated as it is. To get you in line with where other Western countries are, where other in Western, especially Western European countries are, we would have to start putting restrictions on how you do and practice your reproductive technologies through IVF. And that would be in line with what other people have decided based on the recognition that we're dealing with human life, not a commodity, not a natural resource like something you would dig out of the ground. You're making human lives, and then you're putting them in freezers. And so the judge in that opinion says, it does not bother me that this means we may need to revisit the IVF practice in the United States. They are already far more permissive than as it is practiced in other European countries. Other people have already, and you see this in abortion as well, by the way. There are far more restrictions in Germany or England or other places about when and how you can get abortion than there are in the United States. When people, anytime we tried to place any restriction on abortion, people would call us extremists. You're extremist. You want to limit women's access to abortion. We're extremists. We're one of like 6 nations in the world that allow abortion for late terms. Everybody else has reasonable limitations on it. They've come to some agreement that whatever is going on through the practice of abortion, even if you don't think it's a human being, we shouldn't be letting it go on late in pregnancy. United States policy is extremely permissive on abortion. And according to the Alabama Supreme Court decision, it's extremely permissive on in vitro fertilization as well, out of step with other progressive European countries that have put restrictions on there. So that justice of the Supreme Court of Alabama says, we know this means we will have to revisit the practice of in vitro fertilization. We know this means that it may incur a greater regulation of the industry, and that's not a bad thing. We need to be rethinking how we're treating early human life. And it may be time to revisit the entire practice in the United States and how we do it. I don't think that's an unreasonable position to take, especially in light of the fact he's willing to cite multiple other nations who have already reached this conclusion. I think it's completely reasonable for that justice to say, look, I get it, right? If we include in vitro embryos in the category of child, it will mean that we may have to revisit the in vitro fertilization industry and a reproductive industry as is practiced in the United States. So let's just do that. Instead of denying that they're not the immediate progeny of their parents and living human life that's being placed into a freezer, maybe we just do that. Maybe we recognize it by seeing them as included in the human family, that we have obligations and duties to them to not treat them like some weird resource that we can create at will. And then if we make that decision, they point out in there are all sorts of hard cases that are coming our way about how we can figure out when we can remove it. He said partial birth abortion's back on the table, right? If we can largely remove the child from the mother, then that means it's no longer inside of her and it doesn't exist in any meaningfully capacity way as a developing child within her uterus. So we should have the ability to kill it. They said these are questions that are going to come about what we can do with lives that we could gestate all the way through. What if we could place them in an incubator and gestate them all through? And one of the concurring opinions disagrees with that language because they say that the idea of incubating outside of the body all the way through 9 months of gestation just isn't reasonable. And I wonder how much they've actually read the literature on this, because we're actually at the doorstep of being able to do that. And they say, well, most people wouldn't want to do that. I'm not so sure that's true. There was a mock advertisement done a couple of years ago from a company trying to sell the idea that rather than you have your life disrupted by carrying your child, we'll develop your child in a place and you can actually watch it grow. It could be in the corner of your bedroom and you can have your gestational pod there and you can watch your child grow. And when the time comes, we can have a birthing ceremony, but it never has to be inside of you. This was a mock commercial done for the idea that this technology is right around. And then they had these big warehouses filled with babies gestating in there, and everybody else is free to go out and live their life. And they no longer have to go through the pain of pregnancy because we'll just grow your babies in here, which is weirdly like in Man of Steel, at the beginning of Man of Steel, what they claim Krypton has become, right? I don't know if you've seen the movie Man of Steel. If you haven't seen the movie Man of Steel, you should absolutely watch the movie Man of Steel. Underrated superhero movie. I still think it's one of the best superhero movies of the last 20 years. I love that movie. And at the beginning of the movie, they had developed one of the things, the criticisms of the development of Krypton as a country, as a culture, is that they no longer have natural childbirth. What they do is they grow their children much like what we're talking about here. And they say if that's possible, then through the entire developmental process, no matter how developed they are, no matter how close they are to being birthed, no matter how far along they are in their gestation, just because they've been grown outside of the woman, they're no longer members of the human family and we can use them as we wish to. That's the implications for the worldview you're offering us of just being in vitro or outside of the woman means that they're not a member of the human family. Implications go both ways. And one implication, we have to figure out what we're doing with all these human beings that we're growing if we don't consider them fully human and all the things that we're allowed to do to them and the ways that we're allowed to use them as a resource. The implications in the other view is that the IVF industry may come under more scrutiny and may be required to be regulated in a way that they currently aren't. I'm comfortable with that, just as that Supreme Court justice said, Alabama Supreme Court justice says they are. So that's dealing with the children problem and dealing with the idea of the extreme nature of having to regulate IVF. It's really not as big a deal as you think it is. IVF is already more regulated in other countries than it is in the United States. And the term Wild West was used at least twice in describing the IVF industry in the United States and the level of regulation that it has. It's unbounded and needs to be bounded, perhaps. That's just, but today, I'm not making that judgment. What I'm telling you is that's what the argument says. And I do say personally, I think it's reasonable. That's as far as I want to go, but I just wanted to clear that up. So finally, let's get from what is a child to religious interference. The idea that calling an embryo a child is a uniquely religious position. And this was put in the early narrative that I heard about this story. That was what I heard, is forcing the religious beliefs of Christians about early life on others in the state of Alabama. Now, here's what I think is interesting. The actual opinion that makes the decision doesn't talk about religion at all. It talks about Alabama laws that exist. It talks about the definition of child. It talks about the technology. It talks about the differences between civil and criminal cases. It becomes a big deal because they say, well, the same protections as a child don't exist in the criminal code of Alabama, so why should it be allowed in the civil code? And they say, well, the response from them is, and tips, it says that, look, because that's one of the arguments that's offered by the defense. They said civil cases have always been more broadly understood than criminal cases. There's no necessity under the law that they mirror each other. Criminal scrutiny is different. The standards of guilt are much higher. The way that we measure things in a criminal case has a very narrow way. Civil cases have always been more broadly discussed. And the standard of evidentiary proof in civil cases has always been lower than the standard in criminal cases. So that it's not necessary that those two perfectly mirror each other and reflect each other. Now, they point to a case where they said that the statement was made that it can't be criminally charged, but not civilly charged. So you couldn't have the case where it does meet the level of being a crime, but you're not allowed to have a civil case in the same, but for the same offenses. They said that disparity would be wrong because the very narrow nature of criminal cases would require anything that falls into a criminal case could extend over to civil cases. But it's not necessarily true that that goes both ways. The Supreme Court justice says it's not true that everything that can be tried civilly can also be tried criminally. It's possible to have things that can be fought over in a civil case that do not belong in a criminal court. It's not possible to have something that can rise to the level of criminal prosecution that cannot also be tried in a civil court, because the criminal cases just have a more narrow bandwidth, a more narrow focus, a higher level of evidentiary proof necessary to be able to try them. So let's get to the last thing. Is this religious? They don't talk about religion in the opinion. The religion comes up on, what did I write down? Page 26. So we go to page 26 of the decision, and this is after the majority opinion. The Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice of the state of Alabama, writes a concurring opinion where he deals with the case of the terminology of sanctity of life. So Chief Justice Parker says it's important to understand that our Constitution contains the following declaration of public policy. This state acknowledges, declares, and affirms that it is the public policy of this state to recognize and support the sanctity of unborn life and the rights of unborn children, including the right to life. That is the language of the Alabama Constitution. And Chief Justice Parker says to talk in terms of sanctity versus like the inviolability of life, or something in natural rights conversation where we just talk about the intrinsic dignity of life as it can be argued through natural rights that don't require us to appeal to God or the Bible. He says when we're using the term sanctity, we are using religious terminology. Now, he says this, by the way, as an affirmation. He doesn't have a problem with this. And this is where it gets interesting, because he says the Constitution the Constitution of Alabama was established by the people of Alabama. And he's not the only one that makes this claim, but in the decision he says the Constitution guides the three branches of government with authority. It tells the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches what they can and can't do in the state of Alabama. And he said, and if the people of Alabama are comfortable with the terminology sanctity of life, so comfortable with it that they have established it as part of the state constitution, then the people of Alabama are informing the legislative, the judicial, and the executive branches of Alabama, that there are certain things that must be recognized. And for Chief Justice Parker, he says the sanctity of human life is tied up into the value of human life determined by our relationship with God. We are created in God's image, the image bearers of God. We have value based on that. And that creates this concept of sanctity. And he says it is not illegitimate for the people of Alabama to argue on those terms if they can convince enough people in Alabama to agree with them, and then to establish parameters by which the government of Alabama must operate. So they declare it's a sanctity of life issue. They didn't use philosophical terminology. They used theological terminology, the sanctity of human life. And he gives a defense of it, a legal defense of it, citing cases. It's an interesting read. Now, why I thought this was interesting was because I just wrote an article for Christian Research Journal on this idea of religion and politics. And in it, the argument I think the article is available at Christian Research Journal at equip.org at their website. My article is the first in a series called Back to Basics. It's called Christianity is Better, What Place for the Christian in a Post-Christian Political World. And in there, I talk about the idea of hearing on college campuses that we should keep our religious beliefs to ourselves. And I go back and evaluate it based on looking at the founding fathers, and as much as I can through different things that I've read, different authors, different historians, to understand as best that I can what the original intent of the concepts of like separation of church and state and free exercise of religious beliefs intended. And the founding fathers did have a great, or at least anxiety about a state religion. They didn't want a particular religious denomination to be able to run the country, but they never had any anxiety at all about religious people participating in the government. Religiously motivated people from arguing from their beliefs to what is best for the human flourishing in the United States of America. That was never a problem for them. They didn't bar it. They didn't stop. And by the way, as a side issue, these were people that were not afraid to restrict practice and political. I mean, they were not afraid to tell people you don't get to have a voice in politics. They did that with women, right? From the outset, these are people that said, we want people to have a voice in the government, not women. You don't get to have a voice in the government for all sorts of reasons, none of which we would acknowledge today as good, but they had reasons. And those reasons are largely tied in oftentimes too into why they wanted only landowners to be able to vote. So the founding fathers and the errors that they committed, but one of the things that they found very important was that they had to be sure that the people who were voting or had power in the government were not beholden to someone else. So there was a natural distrust of people who didn't own their own land, because that meant they lived on someone else's land, which meant that the person who owned their land might come to them and say, if you wish to stay on my land, then you vote X. And the same thing was worried about with women, because it was a more patriarchal society at that time, in the truest sense of that word, not in the way that we talk about it today, but in that women stayed home and men worked and earned their living. They were worried that if women were given the right to vote, it would just multiply the votes of bad men. They could go to their wife and say, you will vote this way, and she would not vote her own conscience. Of course, we morally grew as a nation, and then we got past these ideas. I only bring that up to be clear. And then obviously they didn't let slaves vote. So, I mean, and they didn't let indigenous Americans or Native Americans or Indians vote, right? So these were not people that were shy about saying, you don't get to have a say. And there were many people who were deeply religiously motivated that were a part of the founding of our nation. And so the fear of a state institution where a single group of religious believers, a single denomination, dominated policy was legitimate in them. But there was no fear of the active participation of religious individuals trying to convince people that their views, even though they might not be held by everybody, are best for society. When I argue that the unborn ought to be treated with dignity and respect, I'm arguing that an inclusive view of human value if we understand that every human being who exists ought to be treated with dignity and respect, and that it's a dangerous game to divide up the human family between those people that we call persons, who we treat as valuable, and those that we just merely human, and we can do to them whatever we want, we run the risk of ultimately being victim to that view. If someone can dehumanize me enough, they can do whatever they want to me. It's better for everyone if we operate from an inclusive view of human value. I have religious motivations for believing some of these things. I'm a deeply religious, deeply passionate Christian man. I love Christ more than I love you. I don't know who you are, but I love him more than I love you. That's true of anybody listening to me. My first duty and obligation is to love the Lord our God and to love my neighbor as myself. And I believe that the best way for our country to see human flourishing is to treat every human being as if they're valuable. And in cases like this, where it may introduce into consequences into our daily life, where we are required to revisit something that we're doing, I say, let's revisit it. If it means that everybody gets treated a little better, then let's see if we can treat every human being a little better. So it's interesting. He's making the case that this isn't a religious interference. Let's just say that this is a moral agreement of a community, that within the borders of this state, this is how we see human beings. And we were able to get a broad enough agreement on this that seeing human beings through this light would be best for the flourishing of all people in Alabama. And he said, it's that will of the people to support this concept of sanctity of life that the three branches of the government must respect. Should the people of Alabama change to such a degree that they amend that, then we would be required to respect that amendment. But the voice of the people of Alabama through Alabama's Constitution right now supports a concept of sanctity of life. And in there are theological implications, and that he says he has no interest in denying. I just believe that human beings are the image bearers of God. And I believe that many of my Alabama neighbors believe that too. And because of that, we feel it necessary to protect life from the moment it comes into existence. It's not forcing their religion on anybody. It's growing consensus. And you, through that consensus. Now, as I've told other people, and as I've read in other places, and I got this from other sources, when people say you can't force your religious beliefs on everybody, it's like, I'm not forcing a religious belief on you. I am trying to get the community to accept a standard of behavior towards other human beings and accept a definition of what other human beings are that I believe is best for the flourishing of all human beings in our country, in my state of Georgia, in the state of Alabama, wherever. And if I can get that consensus, that's all that I need. I don't need universal approval. It's not our job ever to get everyone to agree with us. That will never, ever happen. And the reason that we have laws is entirely for that point. We will never convince everybody that rape is wrong. There are just people out there who are sick and they are going to choose to rape. So the laws against rape are to deal with those people who cannot be convinced of the moral case of rape and who don't care about the consensus moral opinion of the public. We reject rape as deeply immoral and violent. We have laws against it because we recognize that there will always be people who violate the law and reject the moral standards of our community. And if we can convince enough people that human life ought to be respected from the moment it comes into existence to the time that it dies, we need to, as a society, do our best to honor that concept. And it will be best for the flourishing of all if we do that. It's not necessary that I get 100% of people to agree with me. It just becomes necessary for those who wish to violate that law to recognize that they are living outside of the determined will of the people. And they don't get to do whatever they want. That's all that we're talking about here. And that's what he's saying. He's saying that right now the will of the... Now, it may be the case that Chief Justice Parker is wrong in the sense that the people who voted or enshrined the Alabama Constitution understood the concept of sanctity of life in a theological manner. It may be that he's wrong about that, and that they, like so many other people, are capable of reaching the position that human life ought to be treated with dignity and respect without appeal to the Bible or to the idea of the image bearer of God or to traditional concepts of human relationships with the image bearers of God or the Ten Commandments or anything like that. It may be he's mistaken that is the popular understanding of sanctity, and that would be a definition issue that we would have to have a conversation about. But that's what he's claiming about, and so the hysteria over forcing religion on people, that falls into that category. And in the article that I wrote for CRJ, for Christian Research Journal on this issue, I talk about the idea that religious motivation has been behind some of the most powerful social movements in the United States and motivated some of the most powerful people that we study. Harriet Tubman was a deeply religious person that talked about her faith in God, and it drove her to become, to overlook her own comfort and to seek to free other people. Frederick Douglass, when he talks about throwing off the bondage of slavery, he talked about when he was taught to read. By the way, as a slave being taught to read, it was an act of rebellion that would have been punishable, sometimes by death, but other times towards people having their eyes burned out of their head for daring to be able to read. When Frederick Douglass learned to read, one of the first things he read was the Bible. And he said reading the Bible helped him to see that he was being treated unjustly and that God did not want him to be a slave or to be treated the way that he was. And that anybody who read the Bible in that means was reading it heretically. And then that gave him the inspiration to free himself. He said, God didn't intend me to be a slave, so I will not accept slavery. Go back and look at just the social justice movements in the United States and see how many people spoke powerfully of their motivation to do this through religious terms. Both Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X were deeply religious individuals who spoke in religious terminology. Both of them still venerated today for their passionate fight for the civil rights of black men and women throughout the United States to make the world a better place. Heck, Gandhi stole from Jesus. And one of the most venerated international figures stole from Jesus the idea that if someone strikes you on your right cheek, offer up your left cheek. And he was able to incorporate that concept into a political movement that transformed his nation. The power of just a single teaching of Jesus was transformative of an entire nation. Look at William Wilberforce. Look at Thomas Clarkson and the abolitionist movement in England. Look throughout the world and you will see Christians having done work. Tom Holland writes this in his book Dominion about how Christianity tamed the world. And now because there's things that certain people want to be allowed to continue to do with either without regulation or interference of others, they say keep your religion out of the public sphere. Nonsense. I have no duty or obligation not to voice my concerns about other people, nor do I have to worry about why I have those concerns. I actually had somebody, I was at NC State speaking, and the student stood up and said, what makes you think that you should be allowed to come here and say these things to us here today? And I said, well, first of all, and I went through the case for abortion, and I said, so I have a philosophical case, and I have a scientific case, and I have the opportunity, but after that, after I made my case about what I was there to talk about, I said, but secondly, because this is the United States of America, and I have the freedom to speak out on issues that I think are morally important and to seek political action, to rectify them, and to seek justice in my community. And I have the right to bring justice concerns to my community. I don't have the right to force you to take them, but I do have the right to make my case. And if I can convince enough people that I'm right, then we have the right to express the will of the consensus of a community that injustice be rectified. I don't owe it to you or to anybody else to be quiet about what I believe. I'm allowed to argue about the things that I think are morally important. You're allowed to argue back. And then we have an argument in the marketplace of ideas about what's best for society. But what we don't get to do is disqualify people because they have a particular belief set before they come to argue. We don't get to say, no, because this is the reason that you're arguing what you're arguing. You don't get to argue. That's the genetic fallacy. That's ridiculous. It's the very beginning of bad thinking. And it's ultimately destructive to society at large. We have to allow people to be able to speak. And I mentioned in the article, I'm not even sure how you would do that because most people's religious beliefs are so in flux during the course of their life. I don't even know how you would start to disqualify. What standard of belief do you have to have? What level of commitment do you have to have? What particular book do you believe in? All of these things are ridiculous. Bring your ideas to the marketplace and let's fight them out there. Iron sharpens iron. Let's see whose ideas win. But don't you dare tell people that they're not allowed to believe, bring their deeply held religious convictions to the public square to argue that those convictions are best for human flourishing. You don't get to decide that, and this country was never designed for it to work like that. It was designed so that the country couldn't be run by a particular group of religious believers who forced their theocratic view of the world on everybody else. It was never designed so that religious believers couldn't come to the public and make their case for the public good. That was never a design or idea that was put up for by the founding fathers, and it's never been understood what we mean in the separation of church and state. It never included that idea. There is no way to have a litmus test for religious believers, and we couldn't even do it if we wanted to, because I've made the case in there that fighting for the good of all human beings is part of what it means to be a Christian. And I can't say that I love my neighbor as myself and at the same time abdicate myself for the responsibility to be involved in the politics and law. There has to be good arguments. C.S. Lewis said there has to be good arguments, if only to protect people from bad arguments, right? Has to be Christians out there forming good arguments because somebody has to protect the Christians who don't know any better from the bad arguments. I think that extends beyond that. There has to be good law to fight bad law. There has to be good politicians to get in there and fight against bad politicians. There has to be good ideas fought in the marketplace of ideas so that we can root out bad ideas, because as John Stonestreet says, bad ideas have victims. And we have to care about the victims of bad ideas because we're told to love our neighbor as ourselves. Not just love our neighbor as we love ourselves. That's a higher calling. And I can't do that and abdicate my political responsibilities at the same time. So that when we talk about religion involved in politics, or Chief Justice Parker is talking about the religious nature of the concept of sanctity of life, it's not forcing religion on other people. What he's saying is the will already exists. And the will of those people, expressed through the Constitution of the state of Alabama, binds the legislative and executive and judicial branches of Alabama to work within the boundaries set for them by that will. If the will changes, it can be changed. But it can only be changed by a demonstration of the change of that will. And if they're comfortable with the concept of sanctity of life, then he's comfortable with the concept of sanctity of life, and then the government has to be as well. So that's where I land on where I wanted to get to the meat of what this decision said. Let's go back and review just for a second. A very limited scope. It didn't declare embryos children. It recognized that the law already included them and answered the question of whether in vitro embryos are included in the same protections that already exist under the wrongful death of minors law that already exists, that already covers the unborn in the state of Alabama. And the judge said that their location outside of the body is not philosophically strong enough reason or legally strong enough reason to exclude them from the category of protected human life. They are humans, and as human beings and as the immediate progeny of their parents, they are children and have to be protected. We had somebody point out that the definition of children under the law is consistent with 6 or 7 different resources that they offer, some contemporary and some at the time of the wrongful termination or wrongful death of a minor child was passed in 1872. We have somebody who points out the idea that if the in vitro fertilization has to be revisited and regulated as a result of this decision, that's not the worst thing that ever happened. It's already more heavily regulated in other countries that we accept as modern and progressive. And then finally, Justice Parker's appeal to religious belief isn't the determination of forcing religious belief on others. He's saying that the will of the people of Alabama has already spoken on this issue, and what he believes is theological language and using the sanctity of life, and that doesn't make it illegitimate. And that is no way a violation of the separation of church and state. That's what the case actually said. That's what the decision actually said. Nothing as unreasonable as you're hearing about the panic in the public. So why do they hate it so much? Because it just plays into the same narrative problem that the people who want to be able to continue to use human life as resources, to destroy life before it's born, to treat human beings and human life cheaply. They want to be able to continue to do the things that they do. And in order to do that, they have to dehumanize the subjects or objects of their actions and behavior. And anytime anyone pushes back against it, they go crazy. They go nuts. They yell and scream. And if you're the person that pushed back against them, then you get all of the focus. But that's fine. Because at the end of the day, it's worth being hated by those people if what you're fighting for is an inclusive view of human value where all human beings are treated with dignity and respect. All right, I'm going to be making use, hopefully, of the bigger table soon. I have somebody, a friend of mine who has worked in nonprofits and politics for years, who wants to come in and talk about a Thomas Sowell book. And we're going to discuss the conflict of civilizations. So we're going to come in and talk about, he's going to come in and join me on that. I'm also talking to a scholar to come in and talk to me about just war. That's on the table. I want to do an embryo episode this season. We're working on that. I'm trying to get that author to come back in. Excited to be back and to see what we're doing here in season 3. Excited about the new place and the possibilities. And I'm going to bring back students. I got a couple of students that are coming back that want to sit at the table here, and they're going to bring back their objections. We got more cameras we're going to have ready. This is about to get so cool. This is about to get really exciting. So if you're enjoying it, please go to merelyhumanministries.org and donate to help our cause. If you're not enjoying it, I don't know why you're still listening at this point, because this is the end of the show. So then you owe it to us. If you hate listening, as I always say, to keep paying, because you need me. I feel your hate. You need me, right? I feel that anger. And I'm happy to do it, man. I'm happy to be hated by you. And I'll continue to make this stuff as long as we can. I want to say a silent prayer tonight for Hall & Oates, that they can be reunited in some way. They can get past this. I'm grateful for the continued de-escalation of violence between otters and human beings. I stand resolute in my distaste for chimpanzees. And that's all. Thank you so much for joining us today.